I didn't see it coming. The night I thought would be celebration turned into my worst nightmare. The apartment felt too small, even though we'd lived there my whole life. String lights hung across the living room, casting warm shadows on the exposed brick walls. My fiancé Daniel stood beside me, his hand resting gently on my lower back as friends and family crowded into every corner. Laughter bounced off the hardwood floors, mixing with the soft jazz playing from someone's phone. I could smell the garlic from the pasta my cousin had brought, the sweetness of the champagne someone had already opened. "To Grace and Daniel," my Aunt Sarah called out, raising her glass. A chorus of voices echoed her. I felt my cheeks flush, a smile spreading across my face despite the nervous flutter in my chest. This was it, the moment I'd been hoping for. The family gathering where everyone would celebrate us, where I'd finally feel like I belonged. My grandmother sat in the corner armchair, the one she always claimed at family events. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore the pearl necklace I'd helped her fasten earlier. She smiled at me, but there was something in her eyes I couldn't quite read. Sadness? Worry? I pushed the thought away. Then my Uncle Richard cleared his throat. The room quieted instantly. He had that effect on people. Something about the way he carried himself, the way he commanded attention without even trying. He stood near the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his expensive suit jacket unbuttoned. "Before we go too far into the celebration," he said, his voice cutting through the warmth like a knife through butter, "there's something the family needs to know." My stomach tightened. Daniel's hand pressed firmer against my back. "Mother has made some recent changes to her estate planning," Richard continued, nodding toward my grandmother. I watched her face go pale. "I think it's only fair that everyone understand the new arrangement, especially given Grace's circumstances." The word hung in the air like smoke. Circumstances. "Richard, this isn't the time." My Aunt Sarah started, but he waved her off. No, it's better to be transparent. Grace has been very devoted to Mother over the years, we all know that. But Mother has decided, after careful consideration and with proper legal counsel, to adjust the distribution of her assets. The bulk of the estate will now be divided among her children, my siblings and myself, with smaller provisions for the grandchildren. I felt the room tilt slightly. Smaller provisions. I'd spent the last 5 years helping my grandmother with everything. Her doctor's appointments, her grocery shopping, sitting with her during the long afternoons when loneliness crept in like fog. I'd rearranged my work schedule countless times. I'd given up weekend plans, not because I expected something in return, but because she was my grandmother and I loved her. But I'd also known, everyone had known, that she planned to leave me a significant portion of her estate. She'd told me herself years ago, squeezing my hand across her kitchen table. "You've been like a daughter to me," she'd said. "I want to make sure you're taken care of." "Wait," I heard myself say, my voice sounding thin and distant. "Grandma, is this?" She wouldn't look at me. Her hands twisted in her lap, and she stared down at the pearls around her neck. "It's all been properly documented," Richard said smoothly. "Mother's lawyer has everything in order. I just thought, given that we're all here, it would be good to clear the air." The room had gone completely silent. Even the music seemed to have stopped, though maybe I just couldn't hear it anymore over the rushing in my ears. I saw my cousins exchange glances. My Aunt Sarah's mouth hung slightly open. Daniel's hand slipped from my back as he stepped forward, but I grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Why?" I asked, looking past Richard to my grandmother. "Why didn't you tell me?" She finally met my eyes, and what I saw there broke something inside me. Guilt. Shame. But also resignation, as if she'd made peace with this choice, even if it destroyed me. "Grace, honey, it's not personal," Richard said, and I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of that statement. "It's just practical. You're young, you're getting married," he gestured toward Daniel. "You'll have your own life. The rest of us have families, responsibilities. Mother wanted to be fair." Fair. The word tasted like ash. I set my glass down on the coffee table with a hand that shook. "I need some air," I whispered. I pushed through the crowd, past the concerned faces and the awkward silence, and made it to the small balcony off the living room. The night air hit my face, cool and sharp. Below, the city hummed with life cars passing, people walking home from dinner, completely unaware that my world had just collapsed. Behind me, I could hear the party slowly resuming, voices carefully avoiding what had just happened, laughter a bit too forced. Inside, through the glass door, I could see Richard talking to someone, gesturing with his glass, completely at ease. And my grandmother, still sitting in her chair, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. 1 month before the party, I hadn't known any of this was coming. My mornings were simple, predictable. I'd wake up in my modest studio apartment, the one with the squeaky radiator and the view of the building next door. Sunlight would filter through the thin curtains, and I'd lie there for a moment, listening to the sounds of the city waking up. I'd make instant coffee, the cheap kind, because that's what I could afford, and sit at my tiny kitchen table, scrolling through my phone. I'd send my grandmother a good morning text, something cheerful and simple. "Hope you slept well. Love you." She'd usually respond with a heart emoji and a brief message about her plans for the day. Then I'd get ready for church, not because I felt particularly close to God, if I'm being honest, but because it was what I did. It was part of the routine, part of who I was supposed to be. Grace, the good Christian girl. Grace, who showed up. Grace, who tried. The church was a small community place about 15 minutes from my apartment, an old building with wooden pews and stained glass windows that threw colored light across the floor on sunny mornings. I'd slip into a seat near the back, nod hello to the regulars, and let the service wash over me. The worship songs, the prayers, the sermon. I participated mechanically, saying the right words, standing and sitting at the right times. But inside I felt hollow, like I was going through the motions of faith without really touching it. God felt distant, theoretical. I believed he existed somewhere out there, but I wasn't sure he paid much attention to someone like me. Someone ordinary, someone easily forgotten. After church, I'd stop by the grocery store, picking up basic supplies for the week. Pasta, canned soup, bread. I'd count out the bills carefully at the register, always aware of how little margin I had. Then home again, to spend Sunday afternoon doing laundry or cleaning my small space, the hours stretching out quiet and long. Loneliness wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. A low hum in the background of everything I did. I had coworkers I liked well enough, friends from college. I'd text occasionally, my small group at church that met every other week. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was invisible, that if I disappeared tomorrow, it would take people a while to notice. I worried about being a burden, about asking too much, about not having enough to offer. Several days later, I found myself at my grandmother's apartment in the afternoon. The building was older than mine, with an elevator that groaned as it climbed to the 4th floor. Her apartment smelled like lavender and old books, a scent that had been constant my entire life. "Grace!" she called from the kitchen when she heard me unlock the door with the spare key she'd given me years ago. "I'm just putting the kettle on." I found her standing at the stove, her movements slower than they used to be, her hands shaking slightly as she poured water into her favorite teapot. She wore a soft cardigan, the blue one I'd given her last Christmas, and her hair was down, wispy and white. "Let me help," I said, taking the kettle from her gently. She protested, but only half-heartedly. We both knew she needed the help, even if she didn't like admitting it. We settled in her living room, tea steeping between us. The afternoon light came through the lace curtains, and I could hear the muffled sounds of the city outside. On the wall across from me hung the photograph I'd been looking at since I was a child. My grandmother as a young woman, standing in a garden, her face bright with hope and joy. I'd always loved that photo. It made her seem timeless, invincible. We talked about small things, her doctor's appointment from last week, the book she was reading, my work at the administrative office downtown. She asked about Daniel, and I told her about his new project at the architecture firm, how excited he was about it. "He's a good man," she said, patting my hand. "You deserve happiness, Grace." I felt a tightness in my chest. Did I? Sometimes I wasn't sure. I folded laundry while we talked, matching her socks, smoothing her dishcloths, small acts of service that felt like the only way I knew how to show love. As I worked, I noticed how frail she looked. The way her hands trembled when she lifted her teacup. The way she seemed to drift off mid-conversation, her eyes going distant before coming back to focus on me. "Are you feeling all right, Grandma?" I asked. "Oh, yes, dear. Just tired. Getting old isn't for the weak, you know." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I wanted to ask more, to press deeper, but I didn't. I never did. Instead, I folded the last towel and promised to visit again in a few days. 2 weeks before the party, we gathered for one of our regular family dinners. These happened monthly, a tradition my grandmother insisted on keeping even as it became harder for her to host. This time, we met at my Uncle Richard's place, a spacious apartment in a better neighborhood than mine, with modern furniture and a kitchen island where everyone could gather. Richard was already holding court when I arrived, talking about some business deal he was closing, his voice confident and commanding. My cousins listened, impressed. My Aunt Sarah was setting out plates, and my grandmother sat in the armchair by the window, watching everything with a quiet sadness. "Grace, there you are," Richard called when he saw me. "Come, sit. We were just talking about Mother's finances." I froze in the doorway, my coat still half on. "What about them?" "Oh, just making sure everything's in order. You know, estate planning, medical directives, that sort of thing. It's important to have these conversations while everyone's still lucid." He laughed at his own joke. I slid into a chair at the dining table, my stomach already nodding. Something about the way he said it, the casual dismissal of my grandmother's agency, made my skin crawl. "I've been helping Mother review her will," Richard continued, passing a salad bowl to my cousin, "making sure everything's fair and practical. There are a lot of considerations, you understand. Tax implications, family dynamics, who's in the best position to manage things." "Richard, can we not do this over dinner?" my Aunt Sarah said, her voice tight. "Why not? We're all adults here." "It's better to be transparent." He looked directly at me. "Grace, you've been wonderful with Mother, truly. But we need to think long term. You're young. You're getting married soon. You'll have your own family to worry about. The rest of us, we have more immediate needs." I opened my mouth, then closed it. What could I say? That I'd given up countless hours? That I'd rearranged my life? That I'd thought, maybe foolishly, that my devotion meant something? My grandmother sat silent, staring at her plate. "I just think," I started carefully, "that maybe Grandma should decide these things herself, without so much input." Richard's smile never wavered. "Of course she decides. I'm just helping her see all the options clearly. That's what family does, right? We look out for each other." The rest of the dinner passed in strained conversation. I barely tasted the food. I watched Richard dominate every topic, watched my cousins nod along, watched my grandmother retreat further into herself. I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller and quieter, until I wondered if anyone even noticed I was there. That night, I sat on my bed in my tiny apartment, holding the framed photo I'd taken from my grandmother's living room years ago, a smaller copy of the one on her wall. The young woman in the garden stared back at me, and I wondered if she'd ever felt this worthless, this invisible. I tried to pray. I really did. I closed my eyes and folded my hands the way I'd been taught as a child. "God," I whispered into the darkness, "are you there? Do you even see me?" The words felt hollow, echoing in my empty room. I waited for something, a feeling, a thought, a sense of peace. Nothing came. Just the sound of my neighbor's TV through the thin wall, the distant wail of a siren, the ordinary sounds of a city that didn't care. "Why does this hurt so much?" I asked. "Why do I feel so worthless?" My grandmother's face came back to me, the way she'd looked at dinner, silent, complicit, letting Richard speak for her, letting him reshape her life, our lives, without protest. I set the photo down and lay back on my bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily that night. And when it did, my dreams were filled with voices talking over me, decisions being made without me, a future I had no say in. Days before the party, everything felt different. Daniel and I sat together in my apartment, planning the engagement announcement. He'd proposed 2 weeks earlier, a quiet moment in the park, just the two of us, no grand gestures, no crowd. Just him on one knee, asking me to build a life with him. I'd said yes, feeling for the first time in months like maybe I could be happy, like maybe someone saw me, chose me, wanted me. "Should we invite your whole family?" Daniel asked, scrolling through his phone. "Or just your grandmother and close relatives?" I twisted the engagement ring on my finger. A simple band with a small diamond, exactly what I'd wanted. "Let's invite everyone. I want this to be, I don't know, a fresh start, a celebration." He looked at me with those kind eyes that had first drawn me to him. "You seem nervous. I just want them to be happy for us, for me." I paused. Is that asking too much? Of course not. He pulled me close. "They love you, Grace. They'll be thrilled." I wanted to believe him, I really did. But even as we made plans, sent out texts, arranged for food and drinks, a small voice in my head whispered warnings I tried to ignore. The night before the party, I called my grandmother. "I'm so excited for tomorrow," I told her. "I can't wait for you to officially meet Daniel as my fiancé. I think you're going to love him." There was a pause on the line, longer than comfortable. "Grace, honey, there's something I need to... Grandma, are you okay?" Yes, I'm fine. I'll see you tomorrow, dear. I love you." "I love you too." But when I hung up, the unease didn't leave. It stayed with me through the night, through the morning as I cleaned my apartment and set out decorations, through the early afternoon as people started to arrive. And then the moment came. Richard's announcement, the truth delivered like a bomb in the middle of my celebration. The faces around me, some shocked, some awkward, some carefully neutral. My grandmother's guilt, Richard's casual confidence, and me standing in my own living room, realizing I'd been erased from my family's future without anyone bothering to tell me until it was too late. The string lights still glowed. The food sat uneaten. The champagne went flat, and I stood on the balcony looking down at the city below, wondering how I'd become so small that my own family could forget I mattered at all. I couldn't go back inside. Not yet. The sounds of the party had faded to a low murmur behind me, and I stood there on the balcony, gripping the railing so hard my knuckles turned white. The metal was cold against my palms, grounding me in the moment I desperately wanted to escape. Behind the glass door, I could see Richard still talking, animated and confident. He caught my eye through the reflection and raised his glass slightly, a gesture that felt more like a victory salute than an apology. My stomach turned. The door slid open. Daniel stepped out, his face tight with controlled anger. "Grace, we need to leave," he said quietly. "This is..." "No." I surprised myself with the firmness in my voice. "No, I'm not running. Not this time." I turned and walked back into the apartment. The conversation stuttered to a halt as I crossed the room. My Aunt Sarah was clearing plates with exaggerated focus. My cousins suddenly found their phones fascinating. And my grandmother, she sat in that same armchair, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. "I need to understand something," I said, my voice cutting through the awkward silence. I looked directly at Richard. When exactly did this world change happen? Richard set down his glass, his expression carefully neutral. 3 weeks ago, Mother's lawyer handled all the paperwork. 3 weeks ago. I let the words hang there. "And you waited until tonight, at my engagement party, to tell me?" "Grace, honey, you're being emotional," he said, his tone maddeningly calm. "This isn't personal, it's just business. Family business." Family business. I felt something crack inside me, something that had been holding back a flood. I've spent 5 years caring for Grandma. 5 years rearranging my life, my schedule, my plans. And you call this family business? My cousin Michael shifted uncomfortably. "Grace, maybe if you'd been in a better financial position..." "Don't." Daniel's voice was sharp. "Don't you dare suggest she didn't do enough." I'm not suggesting anything, Michael said, raising his hands defensively. I'm just saying, Uncle Richard has a point about practicality. We all have responsibilities. And I don't? The words came out louder than I intended. I don't have responsibilities? I'm getting married, starting a life, trying to build a future on an administrative assistant's salary in one of the most expensive cities in the country. But somehow, my needs don't count. My grandmother finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace, please. No, Grandma. I turned to her, and seeing the tears in her eyes almost broke my resolve. Almost. You told me, years ago, you told me I'd be taken care of. You said I was like a daughter to you. Was that a lie? It wasn't a lie, she said, her hands trembling. Grace, you have to understand. Then help me understand, please. I knelt beside her chair, my voice dropping. Why didn't you tell me yourself? Why did I have to find out like this? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes darted to Richard, then back to me. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Richard cleared his throat. Mother was confused about what she promised. The lawyer helped clarify. The lawyer you chose, I said, standing up. The lawyer whose fees you paid. How convenient. Are you suggesting I manipulated Mother? Richard's voice hardened. That's a serious accusation, Grace. Is it an accusation if it's true? The room went silent. Even the traffic noise from outside seemed to fade. Richard's jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes. Not guilt, exactly, but a flash of anger at being challenged. I think you need to leave, he said quietly. This is my apartment, I reminded him. You're the guest here. Then I'll leave. He grabbed his coat from the back of a chair. But you need to understand something, Grace. This isn't about you. This is about what's best for the whole family. And maybe, just maybe, you need to stop acting like you're entitled to something just because you were kind to an old woman. The words hit like a slap. I heard Daniel move beside me, but I put my hand on his arm, stopping him. Get out, I said, my voice shaking but clear. Get out of my home. Richard left. My cousins followed, mumbling awkward goodbyes. My Aunt Sarah hugged me briefly, whispering something about talking later, but I barely heard her. Soon, only my grandmother remained, sitting in that chair, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Later that night, after Daniel had gone home and the apartment felt too quiet, I found myself standing outside my grandmother's building. I'd walked the 15 blocks without really thinking about it, my feet carrying me on autopilot. The doorman recognized me and waved me through. The elevator ride felt longer than usual. When I knocked on her door, she answered immediately, as if she'd been waiting. I knew you'd come, she said. We sat in her living room, the same room where we'd shared countless afternoons. The photograph on the wall. The young woman in the garden seemed to watch us with sad eyes. I wanted to tell you, my grandmother said finally. So many times I wanted to tell you. Then why didn't you? She twisted her hands in her lap, the same gesture I'd seen at the party. Richard said it would be easier this way. He said if I told you privately, you'd try to change my mind, that it would cause more conflict. And you believed him? He's my son, Grace, my oldest. He told me he was looking out for the family's future, for everyone's good. She looked up at me, her eyes wet. He made it sound so reasonable. He said you'd understand eventually, that you were young and would be fine. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to feel righteous fury. But looking at her, this woman who'd read me bedtime stories, who'd taught me to bake cookies, who'd held me when my parents fought, all I felt was tired. Were you really confused about what you'd promised me? I asked quietly. No. Her voice was firm despite the tears. I knew exactly what I'd promised, and I meant it. But Richard, he kept talking about tax implications, about how splitting the estate would be complicated, about how his children needed stability. He wore me down, Grace, day after day, until I couldn't think straight anymore. You could have called me. We could have talked about it together. I know. I should have. She reached for my hand, her fingers cold and trembling. I was weak. I'm so sorry. I looked down at our joined hands, hers spotted with age, mine still smooth and young. The photo on the wall caught my eye again, and I thought about the woman in that garden, so full of hope. Had she imagined this moment? Had she ever thought she'd hurt someone she loved so deeply? I should go, I said, standing. Grace, please, I just need time, Grandma. I need to think. I left her there, in that apartment filled with memories, and walked home through the dark city streets. The next morning came too soon. I woke at dawn, my mind already racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard's smug face, heard his words, "Stop acting like you're entitled." I tried to pray, I really did. God, I whispered into the gray morning light, if you're there, if you're listening, I need help. I need to understand why this is happening. I remembered a verse from somewhere. Youth group, maybe, or a sermon I'd half listened to. Something about God using evil for good. Genesis, I thought, Joseph and his brothers. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. But I couldn't see any good in this. I couldn't see any purpose. All I saw was betrayal and manipulation and a family that cared more about money than about love. Can you really bring good from this? I asked the ceiling. Because right now, all I feel is bitter and angry and so tired. The apartment was silent. No dramatic answer, no sudden peace, just the sound of the radiator clanking and my neighbor's alarm going off through the wall. 1 week later, late at night, there was a knock on my door. I almost didn't answer. It was past 10, and I wasn't expecting anyone. But something made me look through the peephole. Mrs. Chen stood in the hallway, her silver hair pulled back in a bun, her kind face creased with concern. She'd been my small group leader at church for years, a woman in her 70s who'd lived through enough to have real wisdom. Mrs. Chen, what are you? I heard, she said simply. May I come in? I made tea, the same kind my grandmother always served. We sat at my tiny kitchen table, and for a while she didn't say anything, just sipped her tea and waited. I don't know what to do, I finally said. I'm so angry, and I hate feeling this way, but I can't just pretend it doesn't matter. Of course you can't. She set down her cup. Grace is not pretending. Grace is choosing to see people through God's eyes, even when it costs you everything. I don't know how to do that. None of us do, not on our own. She pulled a small Bible from her purse, worn and marked with decades of notes. Do you remember Romans 8? I shook my head. She turned to the passage and read, For those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves, so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. Romans chapter 8, verses 14 through 17. Heirs, I said bitterly. That's ironic. Is it? She looked at me steadily. You lost an earthly inheritance, but you've never lost your real one. You're God's daughter, Grace, his heir. Nothing your uncle or anyone else does can change that. The words hit something deep inside me, not my head. I'd heard these verses before, but somewhere deeper, my heart maybe, or whatever part of me had been screaming that I was worthless, forgotten, cast aside. I don't feel like God's daughter, I whispered. I feel invisible. I know. She reached across the table and took my hand. But feelings aren't facts. The fact is, you belong to God. You're adopted into his family, and that inheritance, that love, can never be taken from you. We prayed together before she left, her gentle voice lifting up my pain, my anger, my confusion. When she was gone, I sat in the quiet apartment and let myself cry, really cry, for the first time since the party. 2 weeks later, at church, I almost didn't go. Sunday morning felt too hard, the prospect of facing people and questions too exhausting. But something, stubbornness maybe, or just habit, got me out of bed and through the door. Pastor David was preaching from Matthew 6. I settled into my usual seat near the back, not really listening at first. But then his words began to cut through my fog. Jesus says, "Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes?" Matthew chapter 6, verse 25. I looked down at my worn jeans, my second-hand coat. More than clothes, more than food, more than money. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Matthew chapter 6, verse 26. Valuable. The word settled in my chest. So do not worry, saying, "What shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear?" For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Matthew chapter 6, verses 31 through 33. Seek first his kingdom, not my family's approval, not my inheritance, not even justice. His kingdom, his righteousness. I felt something shift, not dramatically, but like a door opening, just a crack, letting in a sliver of light. 1 month after the party, I found myself in the church community room for small group. I'd thought about skipping, making excuses, but Mrs. Chen had texted me earlier, "We're talking about forgiveness tonight. I think you need to be there." The room smelled like coffee and old carpet. About 10 of us sat in a circle, Bibles on our laps. Tonight's topic, Ephesians 4. Get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Mrs. Chen read, "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ. God forgave you." Ephesians chapter 4, verses 31 through 32. "Just as Christ forgave you," a woman named Maria repeated. "That's the hard part, isn't it? When someone hurts you deliberately." "How do you do it?" someone else asked. "How do you forgive when they don't even apologize?" The room fell quiet. I stared at my hands. "You do it because you remember how much you've been forgiven," Mrs. Chen said gently. "Not because they deserve it, not because it's easy, but because God forgave you when you didn't deserve it either." I felt everyone's eyes on me. They knew. Of course they knew. Small group families always know. "I don't know if I can," I said quietly. "Forgive, I mean. I want to. I think I want to. But when I imagine seeing my uncle again, or even my grandmother," my voice cracked. "I just feel this wall of anger." "That's honest," Mrs. Chen said. "And honesty is where forgiveness starts." A man named Tom spoke up. "My father stole from me, literally embezzled money from my business, and I had to choose prosecute him or forgive him. It took me 2 years to even pray about it without cursing." "What did you do?" I asked. "I forgave him, not all at once, little by little, every day, choosing to release the anger, to pray for him instead of curse him. It was the hardest thing I've ever done." He paused. "But it was also the freest I've ever felt." That night, back in my apartment, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling back to the small group discussion, to Mrs. Chen's words, to Tom's story. The anger I'd been carrying felt like a stone in my chest, heavy and cold. Around 2 in the morning, I felt it. The crushing weight of it all. My breathing got short, my heart raced, and suddenly I was on the floor, gasping, unable to catch my breath. Panic attack. I'd had one before, years ago, but this was worse. I don't know how long I stayed there, curled up on the cold floor. Eventually, my breathing slowed. The panic ebbed, and in the quiet that followed, I felt something break, not in a bad way, but like ice cracking under spring sun. I couldn't do this alone. I couldn't control this. I couldn't fix my family or make Richard apologize or force my grandmother to stand up to him. I couldn't even make myself stop being angry. I crawled to my bed and knelt beside it, my forehead pressed against the mattress. God, I whispered, I can't do this. I've been trying to hold it together, trying to figure out the right thing to do, trying to make sense of all this. But I can't. I just can't. The tears came then, hot and heavy, and I let them fall. I don't want to be bitter. I don't want to spend my life angry at people who hurt me. But I don't know how to let it go. I don't know how to forgive when it still hurts so much. I stayed there for a long time, praying and crying and saying the same things over and over. No lightning bolt came, no voice from heaven. But slowly, very slowly, I felt a kind of peace settle over me. Not happiness, not even close, but a sense that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to figure this all out tonight. Maybe forgiveness wasn't a single decision, but 1,000 small ones. Maybe it started with just being willing to try. Help me want to forgive, I prayed. Even if I can't yet, help me want to. Outside my window, the city continued its endless rhythm. Cars passed. A siren wailed in the distance. Life went on. And in my small bedroom, in the dark hours before dawn, I chose, however shakily, to believe that grace might be possible, even for me, even for them. 2 months after the party, during a private family meeting, I found myself back in my grandmother's apartment. The same living room where we'd shared countless cups of tea, the same photograph on the wall, that young woman in the garden, forever frozen in hope. But this time was different. This time there was a mediator present. Mrs. Patterson, an old family friend and retired attorney who'd known my grandmother for decades. She sat beside my grandmother on the couch, her silver briefcase on the coffee table, her expression serious but kind. My Uncle Richard was there too, along with my Aunt Sarah and my cousins. The room felt crowded and tense. Everyone had been asked to come. No one knew exactly why. "Thank you all for being here," Mrs. Patterson began. "Your mother asked me to facilitate this conversation because there are some things that need to be said." Richard shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. "Mother, if this is about Grace's complaints, Richard, please." My grandmother's voice was stronger than I'd heard it in months. She sat up straighter, her hands folded in her lap, not twisting nervously this time, but steady, resolved. "Let me speak." She looked around the room, her eyes landing on each of us before settling on me. I need to tell the truth, about the will, about what happened. My heart started pounding. 3 months ago, Richard came to me with concerns about the estate. He said there were tax issues, complications with how I'd structured things. He brought a lawyer, his lawyer, who explained everything in ways that made me feel confused and overwhelmed. She paused, her voice wavering slightly. He told me that if I didn't make changes, the family would suffer. That Grace would be fine because she was young and getting married. That I needed to think about everyone, not just one person. "Mother, that's not—" Richard started. "I'm not finished." Her voice was firm. He visited me almost every day for 2 weeks, sometimes alone, sometimes with his lawyer. He never suggested I call my own attorney or talk to Grace. He just kept pressing and pressing until I finally signed the new documents. Mrs. Patterson opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder. I reviewed the original will and the amended version. The changes were made under highly unusual circumstances. Your mother was not given independent counsel, nor was she given adequate time to consider the implications. "This is ridiculous," Richard said, standing up. "Mother was of sound mind." The lawyer confirmed. "Your lawyer confirmed," Mrs. Patterson corrected. "A lawyer you selected and paid for. That's a conflict of interest, Richard, and you know it." The room fell silent. I watched Richard's face cycle through expressions: anger, fear, calculation. Finally, he sat back down, his hands clenched. My grandmother continued, her voice quiet but clear. "The truth is, I always intended for Grace to receive the majority of my estate. She's been like a daughter to me. She's given years of her life to care for me, not because she expected payment, but because she loved me. Tears ran down her weathered cheeks, and I repaid that love by letting myself be manipulated. I was weak. I was afraid of conflict with my own son, and I hurt the person who deserved better from me. I felt my own tears coming. "Grandma," she held up a hand. "Please let me finish. I've already spoken to my own attorney, not Richard's, and I'm in the process of restoring the original will. But more than that, I needed you all to know the truth. What happened wasn't right. It wasn't fair. And I'm deeply sorry." My cousin Michael cleared his throat. "I didn't know. Uncle Richard said it was just a normal estate revision. I didn't know he pressured you." "None of you knew," my grandmother said. "Richard made sure of that." Richard stood again, his face red. "You're making me sound like a criminal." "I was trying to protect the family's interests." "You were trying to protect your own interests," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "And in doing so, you manipulated a vulnerable elderly woman and damaged your family relationships. That's the truth, Richard. You can be angry about it being said aloud, but it doesn't make it any less true." He grabbed his coat. "I don't have to listen to this." "No, you don't," my grandmother said. "But you should know that I love you, Richard. You're my son. But what you did was wrong, and I won't pretend otherwise anymore." He left. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud. The rest of us sat in stunned silence. My Aunt Sarah was crying. My cousins looked shell-shocked. And my grandmother. She looked exhausted, but also somehow lighter, as if speaking the truth had lifted a weight she'd been carrying. "Grace," she said, reaching for my hand, "can you forgive me?" I looked at her. This woman who'd shaped so much of my life, who'd made such a terrible mistake, but was now trying to make it right. And I thought about all those prayers, all those sleepless nights, all those conversations about forgiveness. "I already have," I said, and realized it was true. That night, back in my apartment, I sat on my bed with my Bible open. The pages fell naturally to Romans 8, the passage Mrs. Chen had read to me. I read it slowly this time, letting each word sink in. "For those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves, so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. And by him we cry, 'Abba, Father.' The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ." Romans chapter 8, verses 14 through 17. Children of God, heirs of God, co-heirs with Christ. All this time, I'd been so focused on what I was losing, my grandmother's estate, my family's approval, my sense of security. But I'd been missing what I already had, what no one could take from me. I was God's daughter, not because I'd earned it through caregiving or good behavior or trying hard enough, but because He'd chosen me, adopted me, made me His. "Who am I really?" I whispered to the quiet room. "I'm yours. I'm your daughter. That's who I am." The peace that came wasn't dramatic. No bright lights or sudden euphoria, just a deep, settling calm, a sense of rightness, of home. I prayed for a long time that night. For my grandmother, for my family, even for Richard, though that one was harder. And I pray for myself, for the courage to keep choosing forgiveness, to keep trusting God's love, even when my circumstances felt uncertain. A few days later, at the small group meeting, I knew I needed to tell them. The community room smelled like coffee and Mrs. Chen's homemade cookies. Everyone settled into the circle, Bibles and notebooks in hand. "Grace," Mrs. Chen said warmly, "you look different tonight, lighter somehow." I smiled. "I feel different. I wanted to share something with you all." I told them about the family meeting, about the truth coming out, about my grandmother's apology and my decision to forgive, about reading Romans 8 and finally understanding what it meant to be God's child. "So you got your inheritance back?" Maria asked. Maybe. Probably. I don't know yet. The legal stuff takes time. I paused. But that's not the point anymore. I realized I was so focused on what I deserved, on what was fair, that I forgot about grace, about what I'd been given that I didn't deserve. Tom nodded. That's it, isn't it? When we really get grace, really understand it, everything changes. Mrs. Chen read from Ephesians again. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32. Grace, you're living this verse. It's beautiful to see. It's still hard, I admitted. I'm still angry sometimes. I still have moments where I want to hold on to the bitterness. But I'm choosing every day to let it go, to trust God instead of trying to control everything. What about boundaries? Someone asked. How do you forgive without letting people hurt you again? I'm learning that forgiveness doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. I can forgive Richard and still recognize that he manipulated my grandmother. I can forgive and still protect myself. I looked around the circle. I'm not sure I have all the answers yet. I'm just trying to walk forward one day at a time. The group prayed over me before we left. Hands on my shoulders, voices lifting up my journey, asking God to give me strength and wisdom and continued peace. I cried. Good tears this time. Healing tears. 1 month later, I found myself walking through the city park on a crisp afternoon. The trees were just starting to turn, hints of gold and red among the green. I found a bench overlooking the skyline, the same skyline I'd stared at from my balcony the night of the party, when everything had fallen apart. But now, looking at those same buildings, I felt different. The anger had faded to something manageable. The bitterness had lost its grip. I pulled out my phone and found the passage from Matthew that Pastor David had preached on. I read it aloud, quietly, to myself and to God. Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Matthew chapter 6, verse 25. I thought about my tiny apartment, my modest salary, my uncertain financial future. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Matthew chapter 6, verse 26. A bird landed near my feet, pecking at crumbs someone had left. I watched it for a moment, the small creature that didn't worry about tomorrow. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. Okay, God, I said softly, I'm seeking. I'm trusting. Even when I don't know what tomorrow looks like, I'm trusting that you'll take care of me, because I'm yours, and that's enough. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead. The city hummed with its endless activity, and I sat there feeling a peace I couldn't fully explain but knew was real. Several months later, my morning routine looked different. I still woke up in my small apartment with a squeaky radiator. I still made cheap instant coffee. But now, before I did anything else, I sat by the window with my Bible open. The grandmother's photograph sat on my nightstand, the one I'd held during so many tearful nights. But now when I looked at it, I didn't feel pain. I felt gratitude for the years we'd had, for the lessons I'd learned, for the way God had used even the hardest moments to teach me about grace. I prayed out loud, something I'd started doing after that night with Mrs. Chen. Good morning, Abba. Thank you for this day. Thank you for making me your daughter. The word Abba felt precious now, intimate. The spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship, and by him we cry, Abba, Father, Father? Romans chapter 8, verse 15. Not a distant God, not a God I had to earn, but Father, Papa, mine. I wasn't a slave to fear anymore, not to fear of being rejected, not to fear of not having enough, not to fear of being worthless. I was his, and that changed everything. That same week, I went to dinner at my grandmother's apartment. It was a small gathering, just her, me, my Aunt Sarah, and surprisingly, Richard. He'd called my grandmother a few weeks earlier, asking if they could talk. The conversation had been difficult, but it was a start. The atmosphere was cautious. We weren't pretending everything was fine, but we weren't avoiding each other either. "Grace," Richard said as we settled at the table, "I owe you an apology." I looked up surprised. I was wrong about how I handled things, about pressuring Mother, about dismissing your years of care for her. He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't expect you to just forgive and forget, but I am sorry." "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "And I've already forgiven you, Richard. But I also need you to know I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. I'm setting some boundaries going forward." "What kind of boundaries?" "Family decisions about Grandma's care. I want to be included in those conversations. Financial discussions. I want transparency, and I won't tolerate manipulation or pressure tactics. If we're going to rebuild trust, it has to be on honest ground." My grandmother reached over and squeezed my hand. "That's more than fair." Richard nodded slowly. "Okay, I can work with that." It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. There was still awkwardness, still tension in certain moments. But it was real. It was honest. And it was a beginning. The following Sunday, I stood in the church sanctuary during worship, surrounded by people I'd known for years, but had never really let close. The music swelled around me, and I found myself singing with an openness I'd never felt before. Mrs. Chen stood beside me, her voice strong despite her age. Maria was on my other side with her husband. Tom and his wife were a few rows back. My community, my church family. I thought about a verse I'd read that morning. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Psalm chapter 34, verse 18. He had been close through all of it, the betrayal, the anger, the fear, the slow journey toward forgiveness. He'd been close. I just hadn't always been able to see it. But now I could. Now I felt it. His presence, his love, his steady faithfulness. After the service, I lingered, talking with friends, laughing at someone's story, making plans to meet for coffee. I wasn't invisible anymore. Not because my circumstances had changed that dramatically, but because my perspective had. I saw myself differently now, not as someone easily forgotten or cast aside, but as someone chosen, loved, cherished by the God of the universe. Walking home that afternoon, the autumn sun warm on my face, I thought about everything that had happened, the pain, the betrayal, the slow, difficult choice to forgive, the unexpected peace that came from releasing control and trusting God. My story wasn't over. There would be more hard days, more moments of struggle. My relationship with my family was still a work in progress. My financial situation was still uncertain. Life was still complicated. But I knew who I was now. I knew whose I was, and that made all the difference. If I could say something to you, wherever you're watching this, it would be this: your worth isn't tied to what people give you or take from you. It's not determined by how others treat you or whether they see your value. Your worth comes from being God's beloved child. That's an inheritance no one can steal. Maybe you're in the middle of your own story of betrayal right now. Maybe someone you trusted has hurt you deeply. Maybe you're wrestling with whether to forgive or how to move forward. I won't tell you it's easy. It's not. Forgiveness is one of the hardest things we're called to do. But I will tell you this: it's possible. With God's help, with community around you, with the truth of Scripture anchoring you, it's possible. Where are you tying your worth to things that can be taken away? What would it look like for you to find your identity in being God's child instead? How could you lean more deeply into that love today? I'm still learning, still walking this out day by day, but I'm not walking alone. And neither are you. Let me pray for us, Jesus. Help us to trust your love and forgive those who have hurt us. Teach us to find our worth in you alone and to walk in your grace each day. Give us the courage to choose forgiveness even when it costs us everything. Remind us that we are yours, adopted, loved, cherished. Amen. This week, maybe you could find one small way to practice forgiveness, or set one healthy boundary that reflects God's love. Write down a Bible verse that reminds you of your identity in Christ. Put it somewhere you'll see it every day, because the truth is, you're not defined by what you've lost or what was taken from you. You're defined by whose you are, and you are God's. That's the inheritance that matters. That's the one that lasts forever.